Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 1 of the 21-22 regular season for the San Jose Sharks between them and the Winnipeg Jets, in which the Sharks have won 4-3, their first regulation win to begin a season since 16-17, so a pretty big deal and a nice way to start off the year. But this game didn't necessarily start off particularly well for the Sharks. After a couple of good first shifts, the Winnipeg Jets began to take over and were the much better team through the first period, and they would have the goal to show for it as Pierre-Luc Dubois would make it 1-0 Winnipeg after 20 minutes of play. And early in the second period, things did not get better for the Sharks. A miscommunication, mostly on behalf of Adin Hill between him and Erik Karlsson, would cause the Jets to be able to get a pretty easy shorthanded goal from Adam Lowry. After that point, however, the Sharks seemed to wake up, and it started with the first goal for Sharks newcomer Andrew Cogliano, and this one also shorthanded, that made it 2-1 and got the Sharks back in this game. They would then add a Jasper Weatherby, his first career goal on the power play, to make it 2-2 at the end of the second period. In the third period, the Sharks would continue their onslaught as they would add a goal from Tomas Hertl on the power play as well, which included William Eklund's first career point as he got the secondary assist on that goal. And then Rudolf Balcers at even strength would cap off a 2-0 to 4-2 comeback for the San Jose Sharks. The Jets would get one back from Harkins to make it 4-3, but the Sharks would survive the late period and late game push from the Winnipeg Jets to get the regulation win, to earn themselves the 2 points here and to leave the Jets with none. Moving on to the things to talk about here. Usually in my previous game reviews in previous seasons, I would outline a 2, 3, 4 players to talk about, but here tonight, especially early on in the season, there is a lot to talk about with just how fresh of a look that the Sharks are going with this year. So I will be mentioning a lot of players. So I've got the lineup here for the San Jose Sharks all written out. Usually I would also have the lineup for the Winnipeg Jets, but considering mostly Sharks fans, I would assume, watch these videos, most people probably don't really care who was in the lineup for the Jets. So to talk about for the Sharks, the first line here of Meyer, Couture, and Dahlin, I felt as though was the best line for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. All three of these players were looking pretty good and getting a lot of great chances for themselves and for each other. I thought Logan Couture in particular looked very, very nice, was making some great plays not only offensively, but was a very, very solid force defensively as well. Dahlin, his first career NHL game here, he was robbed of his first career NHL goal on a power play attempt by Connor Hellebuck, but was otherwise probably the best Sharks rookie here tonight, which was definitely nice to see considering there were, I believe, 5 rookies playing for the Sharks in tonight's lineup. So that was great to see from that first line. If we move on to the second line, this one honestly kind of struggled. Besides maybe the fourth line, this second line was maybe the worst line for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. Eklund definitely had a few pretty nice plays, but it felt as though the Jets were definitely trying to lay the body on him, and while Eklund was able to dip and dodge out of those attempts, it at times cost him in turning over the puck. So interestingly enough, at the end of the game, we actually saw Eklund not technically get benched. It was that the Sharks were trying to hold on to a 1-goal lead, and when they would send on the second line of Hertl, Balcers, and Eklund, instead of Eklund, it would be Nick Bonino in his place. Not too surprising. We've seen Bob Booner do this with basically every single young player in the past, but it is definitely still something that Eklund is going to have to sort of ease himself into, which is more of that defensive role, because he was at times a bit of a liability on the defensive side. However, offensively, of course, there were definitely some nice plays. Rudolf Balcers at first, out of the gate in the first period, he seemed very off. The puck was kind of rolling off his stick, bouncing off of his stick a lot, but as time went on, he seemed to get a bit better, and the same could be said about Tomas Hertl. Onto the third line, similarly, as I had said, this is kind of the case for many of the players on the Sharks because the first period was just in general a struggle, but I thought Labanc in particular really looked rough in that first period. He actually was the player on the Sharks to take the first penalty of the season, which isn't too much of a surprise considering Labanc has a bit of a history of being somewhat of an undisciplined player for the San Jose Sharks. But I thought as the game went on, Labanc, Bonino, and Matt Nieto all got significantly better and actually made up a pretty solid third line for the San Jose Sharks. They weren't necessarily generating offensive chance after offensive chance, but they were actually able to possess the puck a decent amount and, more importantly, not give up too many offensive chances to the Winnipeg Jets on their side. Moving on to the fourth line, the Sharks came in with a completely new look fourth line compared to previous seasons. If we look at the first line, Meyer and Couture are players we know. You're looking at the second line, Hurdle especially is a player we know, but Balcers isn't necessarily a new face because of last season. LeBanc, Matt Nieto, not technically a new face, as of course he was on the Sharks previously to arriving from the Colorado Avalanche last season, but again, not too many newcomers besides Bonino on that third line. But when you take a look at this fourth line, this is three players that the Sharks have not seen prior to this season: Andrew Cogliano, Jasper Weatherby, and Lane Peterson. And it was a fourth line that actually got the Sharks back into this game. Cogliano's shorthanded goal, a bit of offense that we weren't necessarily expecting Cogliano to bring to the San Jose Sharks when he was signed in this past off-season. Weatherby scores his first career NHL goal, and that is on the power play. And then Lane Peterson actually looked pretty decent for himself as well. So it looks as though the Sharks have a decent enough fourth line to work with at this point. Once this fourth line can develop and build a bit of chemistry, it can definitely start to look better as each game moves on. Moving on to the defensive side, and this is what I really want to talk about because I thought the Sharks were actually, past the first period, which at times had a couple of shaky moments, I thought were actually very, very solid defensively, at least through the top four defenders. So let's first talk about Mario Ferraro. As we know, he made a meteoric rise last season to playing with Brent Burns on the top defensive pairing and was essentially the number 2 defender for the San Jose Sharks and was one of the best players for the San Jose Sharks last season. And this season seems to be no different. In fact, you could even argue that Mario Ferraro has taken yet another step forward as he looked even better than he did at times last season. Here tonight, Mario Ferraro making some fantastic defensive plays. Still, the offensive plays on this defensive pairing are left much more so to Brent Burns, which is very understandable when you are playing with a player like Brent Burns. But when it comes on the defensive side, Ferraro was insanely solid, and I was hugely impressed with Ferraro's performance in tonight's game. And it does definitely give a lot of hope for, 3-4 years down the line when Brent Burns' contract is done and he likely is retiring and Erik Karlsson is kind of getting up there in age as well, that Mario Ferraro can indeed take over as the number 1 defenseman on this team. I do believe he absolutely has the potential to do that, and he showed it here tonight. Moving on to the second pairing, Erik Karlsson was probably one of the best players for the Sharks in that pretty disappointing first period. He showed a lot of offensive energy, and while it kind of faded as the game went on, kind of in contrast to the rest of the Sharks team, which got better as the game went on, it should be noted that he did definitely seem very engaged early on. One thing that I do want to point out, however, it felt at times that maybe he was trying a bit too hard, which caused him to step up a lot in the neutral zone. And while it did work at times, there were also a few times where Erik Karlsson was actually burned in this regard. And while it didn't necessarily end up in the back of the net against the San Jose Sharks in any of those situations, it's something that Karlsson will want to clean up. You want him to be able to take those risks, but maybe try to calculate them slightly better than he did at times this game. And his defensive partner was Jacob Middleton in this one. And it's no secret that I was not a huge fan of Jacob Middleton. In fact, I thought he was a pretty bad player, all things considered, and I thought Santeri Hataka should have gotten the start here in tonight's game over Jacob Middleton. But I must give credit where credit is due in that Jacob Middleton played by far his best ever game that I've ever seen out of him as a San Jose Sharks here tonight. He looked completely sort of in form on this pairing. He looked very much in place. If I didn't know any better, I would thought that this was, an established top 4 defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. He made such great decisions at times in the defensive zone. Obviously the offense wasn't necessarily outstanding, but again, like I mentioned with Ferraro, this is something to expect when you are on a pairing with Erik Karlsson. He kind of carries the heavy lifting on the offensive side in that pairing, but Middleton was so solid defensively, which came as a massive surprise to me. And so while I was, at a time waiting with bated breath for Middleton to make a single mistake just so I can yell for Santeri Hataka to come into the lineup and be that fourth defenseman here, or that sixth defenseman for the San Jose Sharks, at this point I want to see more of Jacob Middleton because he has taken this massive step forward that we have never seen before from him. So that was definitely quite nice to see. On the third pairing, however, is where we might actually see some substitutions. This Vlasic-Simek pairing was not particularly good at all here tonight. I thought Vlasic had moments here, as same with Simek, who I thought actually had a very active stick. I thought he was actually trying to make some offensive plays happen, which was nice to see, but this defensive pairing was hemmed in their own zone significantly at times this game, which is not a particularly good thing for a defensive pairing that's supposed to be rather solid. You're stacking it with two defensively minded defensemen, and so when they're your worst defensive pairing on the night, that's where you kind of have a bit of an issue. So if Hataka were to find his way into the lineup at some point over this upcoming road trip, it wouldn't surprise me if one of Simek or potentially even Vlasic actually were to step out of the lineup compared to Jacob Middleton, who, as I said, was just that good here tonight. And moving on to, of course, the goaltender, Adin Hill's first career start as a San Jose Shark. How did it go? Well, honestly, not that great here. Obviously, he was very, very solid down the stretch for the San Jose Sharks to hold on to this lead and allow them to get this regulation victory, but it wasn't a great start to his Sharks career. This first goal from Dubois was honestly something that was kind of worrying with Adin Hill back in the preseason of this year, which was that his rebound control isn't necessarily all that great. So he makes the original save on this Winnipeg Jets shot from the point, I believe, from Neil Pionk, but he's unable to control the rebound, and you can definitely blame Rudolph Spalsers for not covering his man in front, which was Dubois, but you're also maybe hoping for a bit better rebound control from Adin Hill. And then, of course, the second goal is pretty much self-explanatory. This is one that Adin Hill should just let the puck go behind the net. Erik Karlsson will pick it up, and there's zero risk of anything bad happening at that point, but instead he tries to make some sort of puck possession play. He ends up shooting this one off of the leg of Erik Karlsson, and it goes to a Winnipeg Jets player and eventually ends up behind him. So a rough start to his Sharks career, but he made up for that in kind. Obviously, the Harkins goal was not necessarily his fault. This one goes off hard off the back wall behind him, straight to Harkins for the easy empty net pretty much goal at that point. And as I said, he was quite good down the stretch, but I'd like to see him at the very least be slightly more solid, and maybe that was just some first game with this new team jitters. We'll see if Hill can get things under control as the season moves on. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday. They will take on the Montreal Canadiens, heading straight for the Canadian road trip right away to start this season. We'll see if the Sharks can continue this season on a good note. Class dismissed.